Welcome back, everybody, to our studies in AQA A-Level Politics. This lesson is going to be focusing specifically on topic number 7. This topic concerns the issue of elections and referendums. Now, specifically, we've actually already spoken about referendums in the previous topic, and I think the reason why I did that was because prior to the sort of new specification that was introduced in 2017, 2018, the referendum section of the UK politics module was actually in the democracy and participation part. So we're actually not going to spend much time at all focusing on referendums in this topic because we've already spent time doing that. Instead, we're going to be focusing specifically and exclusively on elections. Now, we will talk in this lesson and in the next few lessons about a variety of different electoral systems, focusing first in this video on first past the post. And then we will do the others, and then we will also do some case studies looking at a number of key general elections from the past. Specifically, we'll do the 1979 general election, the 1997 general election, 2010, 2017, 2019. And if we have the data available, which I think we probably should by then, we'll cover 2024 as well. So that's the sort of roadmap for this next few lessons. This lesson specifically is talking about first past the post. We will talk about the key features of the first past the post system. We'll ask how first past the post even works, and we'll talk about its advantages and its disadvantages. And so let's begin then. Well, first past the post then is the electoral system for voting that is used in the general elections in the United Kingdom for the House of Commons. So it also is used for a variety of different local elections. You would argue and you would label first past the post as what we call a plurality voting system. Now, a plurality voting system means that the candidate with the most votes in a particular constituency wins. Now, if there are only two candidates, that means that the winning candidate will have over 50%. But if there are more than two candidates, as there often, in fact, always is, then it means that the winning candidate does not need more than 50% to win that particular constituency. All they need is more than the second place, more than number 2. And that can mean that in certain situations, let's say you've got 10 candidates, the winning candidate might only get 30% of the votes, and then the second place gets 20, and then a few of them get 10 or whatever, and that gives you a whole 100% of the constituency, but they only get 30% of the votes, but they still win the constituency as a result. So that's how first past the post essentially works. Let's think about the key features there. The first is the division of constituencies. The United Kingdom is divided into a number of parliamentary constituencies. Each parliamentary constituency elects one member to represent them in Parliament. This is known as a Member of Parliament or an MP. They are represented in the House of Commons. There are 650 constituencies in the United Kingdom, each of which has roughly an equal number of voters, and there are sometimes changes in terms of drawing the boundary lines in terms of trying to better reflect that representation. This is done every few years or so. Now, the way in which it works for first past the post is that in each constituency, on the day of an election, voters will cast a single vote for their preferred candidate. They do this by marking an X next to their name in and on the ballot paper. So you go into the election ballot where you're going to cast your vote. They're set up everywhere. Mine is actually literally less than a minute walk away from where I live, which is very helpful. Today, in fact, you present yourself a voter ID. You get an idea of whereabouts you live. You then go into a ballot booth with a piece of paper and you put an X next to the candidate that you want to represent you for that constituency. Now, it will be the name of the candidate, and it will have often in brackets the political party that they're associated with. Sort of today in sort of general politics, people tend to vote more for the party than they do for the actual person, even though when you are actually casting a vote, you are casting a vote for a particular candidate in your constituency. not necessarily voting for a party, but just bear that in mind. The candidate with the most votes in that constituency will win, regardless of whether or not they have more than half of the votes. This means that all they have to do is win what is called a plurality rather than a majority. The system then is not proportional. It means that the number of seats won by a party does not necessarily reflect the percentage of the total vote that they have received. Because if you think about it, a political party, let's say, that does really, really well in a lot of different constituencies might still not have won that particular seat. So if they came, let's say a political party comes second in 600 of the 650 constituencies, that means that they have not won a single seat in those 600 constituencies, but they still came second. So they have a significant amount of the vote. They have a significant percentage of the overall vote for that party, but they don't have nearly anywhere near the same amount of seats because they came second, so they lost out on those particular seats. And so a party can win a majority of seats in Parliament while receiving less than half of the national vote, and vice versa. And there are examples in which this takes place. So, for example, in 2015, I believe it was the UKIP party, United Kingdom's Independence Party, that won over 3 million votes across the entire United Kingdom, but didn't win a single seat because they didn't have a concentration of votes in a single constituency such that they would be able to get the plurality in that particular constituency. They just got 3 million votes scattered across the entirety of the United Kingdom. The same could be said for the 2024 election and the Reform Party that was headed by Nigel Farage. Now, the Reform Party in 2024 did do slightly better. I believe they got 3 or 4 seats in Parliament, but they got a great percentage of votes, but they didn't get that many seats. That's how the lack of proportional representation is represented. Another example is, of course, that, as I've mentioned already, that no majority is required. A candidate only needs to get more votes than anybody else. And so even if this is not a majority, they can still win that particular seat. And it is very likely that in situations where you have a constituency where there are a number of political parties all vying for that seat, it is likely that the candidate that wins doesn't even win more than 50% of the vote. If you've got a Labour candidate, a Conservative candidate, a Liberal Democrat candidate, a Green candidate, and a Reform candidate, as well as a number of other smaller parties, then it is likely that the percentage of votes is going to be distributed across all of those parties, and that therefore not one person gets 50%. It is just whoever gets the most in that particular constituency. So let's take an example there. Imagine we have a constituency where the vote is split between 3 candidates. Candidate A gets 45% of the vote. Candidate B gets 35% of the vote, so does very well. And candidate C gets 20% of the vote, not 105%, 20% of the vote. In this example, candidate A would win that seat, and they do so despite not getting a majority. All they need is plurality. Now, let's say that the candidate B in that example, the one that got 35% of the vote, belonged to a party where this happened across all 650 constituencies. Let's say in a hypothetical scenario, in every single constituency, the candidate B party got 35% of the vote, and the candidate A party got 45% of the vote. Okay, let's say that this constituency was replicated across the entire of the United Kingdom. What would that look like in Parliament? Well, in Parliament, that would look like a political party in which the party themselves collectively only got 45% of the vote, and yet they got 100% of the seats. They won every single seat. Equally, the other party, the one that got 35% of the vote, that's still millions and millions and millions and millions of votes, they didn't get a single thing. That's why it is not proportional. That's why there is a lack of proportional representation. Now, you might think, well, that's not a particularly good system. Why do we have this system? Why is this a system that is in use? Well, there are advantages to this system. Okay, this is an example. I believe this is the 2019 general election that you see the massive Tory majority and the failure of the Red Wall by the Labour Party. So, what are the advantages? The first advantage is simplicity. Okay, and that is not an advantage that should be scoffed at. Okay, first past the post is easy to understand for voters. Voters only need to choose one candidate, and the system is very straightforward and it's very easy to understand. One of the things that is important in a democracy is being able to understand how the system works. When it is so convoluted that you don't even understand how any of it works, then you're less likely to vote, you're less likely to care, and you're less likely to engage yourself in politics. This, of course, leads to a democratic deficit and leads to a situation in which voters get turned off and they don't care, and then you have less votes, you have less turnout, and you would argue that it is a less democratic system. So the fact that it is easy to understand and easy for voters to get their heads around is a very important thing. Not everyone is studying A-level politics like you, and so not everyone cares that much about politics and only go to think about politics when they go to a general election. Another advantage is the fact that there is a strong amount of local representation. Each member of parliament represents a specific geographical area. They represent a specific constituency. This allows them to have a direct link between the voters and their elected representative. If I want to speak to my MP, I can email them. I can email my MP, and I can actually probably get a meeting with my MP. I don't know who my MP actually is. I'll think about that. I remember who my old MP was before I moved into a different constituency. But generally speaking, you can speak to your MP, and you can actually get a meeting with your MP often, and you can actually get in contact with them. That provides not only a direct link to the person who you are being represented by in Parliament, but it also means that those MPs are held accountable by their local constituents. If you ignore your constituents and you don't care and you just go to Parliament and do parliamentary things, then you're less likely to get elected by the time the next election comes around. You're held accountable by your own local constituents. That is a good benefit of this system that we have. Now, this one is a little bit problematic given the recent few elections that we have seen, but generally speaking, first past the post, because it is not proportional, because it tends to favour candidates even if they don't have the same percentage of the vote, it means that it tends to produce strong governments. So in the example that I just gave of candidate A and candidate B, for example, if you have a situation like that that replicates across the entire United Kingdom, even though they don't get a high percentage of the votes, they get a high percentage of the seats, and that leads to a strong government, okay? It leads to majority government, where one party has enough seats to govern without needing to form coalitions with other political parties. This tends to create clear stability and clear leadership. Parties win the seats and therefore gives them a mandate to implement the policies that are cited in their manifestos, and this tends to lead to a productive parliament. It tends to lead to a situation in which the government is able to pass legislation at a productive rate. Closely linked to this previous example of an advantage, you have the fact that it avoids coalitions. Now, there is some movement about whether or not coalition is even a good idea or not, but generally speaking, coalitions are seen as less productive than a single unified government. If you have a coalition, so for example the 2010 coalition between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats, you don't just have to get on board the issues and the ideas of your political party, you also have to agree with the coalition in a number of quite significant votes about what they think about a particular thing. And Conservatives and Liberal Democrats disagree about all kinds of different things, so you have to, in that case, they were generally less productive, or they had to try and avoid intense disagreement between themselves internally about the direction of policy. And so, generally speaking, if you are of the opinion that coalition politics is not particularly helpful and is not very productive, and therefore we should be trying to avoid it, then a first past the post system tends to produce strong governments and therefore tends to avoid coalition governments. Now, obviously, the examples that you could think about is the fact that no party won a majority in 2010, as we saw with the coalition, and no party won a majority in 2017, where they didn't necessarily have a coalition with the DUP, but it was a sort of a working arrangement with the DUP that allowed for for the Conservatives to run as a sort of a minority government in 2017. So there are counter arguments, of course, to first past the post there. So if you were writing an essay, for example, about the strengths and weaknesses of first past the post, you could bring that up as a point about why it's a good thing that first past the post exists, because it avoids coalition governments. And then the counter example is that, well, while it's supposed to avoid coalition governments, we've seen in the last 5 or so elections that coalition governments or no strong majority has actually been relatively common. It's happened twice, for example, in the last 5. A final point of importance is the avoidance of extremist parties. So parties that are particularly unpleasant extremists, whether they're extremely far left or extremely far right, tend to not get much in terms of the number of seats in Parliament, despite the fact that they get quite a lot of votes. So some of you may be of the conclusion, I would say correctly of the conclusion, that the UKIP party was full of a number of extremists, a number of racists, in fact, and the fact that they won 3 million votes in 2015 would have been quite problematic, not for the fact that they didn't win a single seat. So they were able to sort of, first past the post is able to protect against extremist politics. Now, from a sort of philosophical perspective, you might want to argue against that and say, well, even if it's an extremist party, then if it gets a lot of significant support, then surely it should the reward of having that kind of support is surely to be represented in Parliament, and it would be anti-democratic even for extremist parties. Now that takes you down a very long road of sort of philosophical debate about things like the paradox of tolerance and whether or not extremist political parties should, in a democratic society, get representation and all these different kinds of things. That's not for this particular lesson. Let's instead move on to the disadvantages of first past the post. And the key disadvantage, as you can probably imagine, is the fact that it is a disproportionate system. It produces results that are not proportional to the votes that are cast. So a party can win a large number of seats and only get a small percentage of the national votes, and conversely, a party can win a significant proportion of the national vote but get little to no seats in Parliament. And the example that I've been using at multiple different points in this series is the 2015 election, UKIP receiving about 12.6% of the national vote, which is around 3 million votes, but not winning a single seat in the House of Commons. And that's where you get the idea of a disproportionate system. There is also the fact that a lot of votes are what we call wasted. It means that they do not contribute to the electing of a candidate. This happens in one of two ways. So firstly, it happens where you have votes for losing candidates. So all the votes for candidates that do not win an election are essentially discarded. But also, specifically, you have excess votes. If a candidate wins by a very large margin, then any votes that they receive beyond what is necessary are effectively wasted. So let's say you have a constituency in which you have 3 political parties, three candidates, candidate A, B, and C. Let's say that candidate B, the second place candidate, wins 30% of the votes. Well, all that means is that you need to get 30% of the votes plus 1 in order to beat them and to win that entire constituency. That's all that is necessary for that particular candidate. But what if candidate A won 50% of the votes? Then that whole 20%, that could be thousands, even tens of thousands of votes, is completely wasted. Is completely wasted because all you needed was 1 extra. So if you then count that across 650 constituencies, you can see how you have potentially millions of votes that are wasted because they're not necessary for the result. This contributes continually to disproportionality. Now, first past the post can be vulnerable to the issue of gerrymandering, where electoral candidates' electoral boundaries are drawn in ways that favour one party by essentially including voters that will be more likely to vote for one party or another. This isn't something that really happens as much in the United Kingdom. This is a much bigger problem in the United States, where there is a much more partisan gerrymandering process in which essentially district boundaries for House of Representatives is drawn in a particular way such that it can favour Republicans versus Democrats or vice versa. So bear that in mind. Bear that in mind when we think about US politics in your second year. But just think carefully about the use of that as an example in the United Kingdom. More important though, for first past the post, is the idea of tactical voting, because of the system in which you have disproportionality in first past the post. It encourages tactical voting, where voters may not vote for their preferred candidate, but they instead vote for a candidate who has a better chance of defeating the party they dislike. Let's say we're going into the 2024 general election. Let's say I'm a massive advocate for the Green Party, but I know that the Green Party is unlikely to win the constituency that I'm in, and so. But because I hate the Tories, for example, or I hate reform, I'm going to then vote for Labour. Even though I don't particularly want to vote for Labour, I'm going to vote for Labour anyway, because I'm going to vote tactically in order to ensure that the Tories don't get in. That's an example of tactical voting. And it raises questions about democracy. If you're voting for a party that you don't want, but you want less than the party that you really don't want to get in, then what does that say about actually democratically voting on the basis of what you believe in as a particular voter? You have to bear that in mind when thinking about tactical voting. And because you've only got one vote in first past the post, when we get to looking at other voting systems in future lessons, you'll see that there is ways in which you could rank choice voting, or you could have a preferred candidate and a backup candidate. Those are systems that try to diminish or to limit the amount of tactical voting that exists. There tends to also be regional imbalances. So in some areas, one party might dominate, while in other areas, the opposition might be very strong. This can lead to certain parts of the country being underrepresented in Parliament, because if they have a significant amount of support from a particular party, even if they have a significant amount of support from a particular party, this regional bias can again have questions and raise questions about the democratic nature of first past the post. And then finally, first past the post sometimes results in a government being formed by a party that does not have the support of the majority of voters. In fact, in a lot of cases this happens. The majority of voters might have voted for candidate B, C, and D collectively, but because candidate A won a plurality, that means that they win and are able to have a mandate in government. And so you end up with systems where, even though they have the majority in Parliament, they didn't have the majority of the popular vote. Again, this is another disadvantage that you could think about in relation to first past the post. And so generally concluding here then, it's a simple system, first past the post. It often tends to create strong and stable governments, but just like with all these electoral systems, it does have its flaws. Arguably the largest flaw is probably the disproportionality element of it, because it's a plurality system. These shortcomings have led to calls for electoral reforms, such as the 2011 alternative vote referendum. But so far, we see that first past the post remains as a significant system that we will probably be using in elections for many years to come.